So today's seminar speaker is Professor John Evans. John earned his MA and PhD in sociology from Princeton University. He's done a number of different things since, including being a postdoc at Yale, having visiting professorships at universities in Edinburgh and Munster. His work focuses on culture, politics, religion, and science, with a particular interest in sociology. He's working at the University of California at San Diego, where he's been since 2001, where he's professor of sociology. Earlier this year, he published a book which is available on the bookstore entitled What is a Human? What the Answers Mean for Human Rights. And his talk today is related to that. He's going to speak to us on scientific and religious definitions of a human, their impact on human rights. So we welcome John for me.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here to talk with you today. The structure of this talk is probably not very smart, which is I'm going to try to summarize essentially 2/3 of that book that was just told you about. But the problem is, unlike some academic work, you can't chunk it into articles and have it make any sense. You have to see the whole thing. So we're going to do sort of a whirlwind tour here and gloss some details in the middle. But it's actually premised by a really important question. As a matter of fact, I would argue that what it means to be human is the central, longest-running question in at least Western intellectual thought. Following the theological strands of these debates, I'm going to call these human self-conceptions anthropologies. Okay? But now note that this is not the discipline of anthropology. That discipline got its name because its original question was what it means to be human. I also want to clarify at the outset that I'm not concerned with scholarly claims about what humans truly are. Sociologists really have no way of accessing that question. Only claims of what the public thinks humans are. But it's important because humans don't act on what is true, they act on what they think is true. And there are multiple claims that believing in a particular anthropology leads people to treat people in a particular manner, independent of the truth of what a human actually is. The most common claim made by critics is that holding what they consider to be a false idea of the human, a false anthropology, leads to inhumane treatment. So the paradigmatic claim is that the way that you engage in a genocide is first you have to define all those people as somehow not human. So a second thing I want to be clear about. I make a distinction between contested and uncontested humans. An uncontested human is an entity that all of the dominant debates about anthropology think are human. Me, you, the prisoner in the jail, so on and so forth. I'm not interested in contested humans at this point, which are things like that not all anthropologies agree with. Things like embryos, fetuses, chimpanzees, people in comatose states, and so on and so forth. So the question is, if we examine the views of the public writ large, are the people who believe in particular notions of the human more likely in ever so small a way to treat people more poorly? So, of course I'm in Britain, and no one knows who this person is in the US, but you've heard of Richard Dawkins. But unlike most, I'll actually be friendly with Mr. Dawkins here. He's, as you know, a dominant atheist defender of Darwin. He's also the vice president of the British Humanist Association, which is a defender of human rights. And he was accused by a journalist once of exactly what critics say, which is because he believes in this biological definition of the human, he must then treat people in this particularly poor way. And he basically wanted to make this distinction. He says that no self-respecting person wants to live in a society that operates according to Darwinian laws. I'm a passionate Darwinist when it involves explaining the development of life. However, I'm a passionate anti-Darwinist when it comes to the kind of society in which we'd want to live. A Darwinian society would be a fascist state. So another way to describe this entire project is I'm testing whether the humanistic Dawkins is actually representative of the people in the US. Unfortunately not Britain, so you have to sort of extrapolate for what it's worth. So here's the structure of my talk, and I know it seems like a lot, but whenever you see red, that means that's where I am. So if people sort of check out for a while because you're digesting your food, you can check back in where you see red. The entire talk is set up as a comparison between academic claims about the effects of these anthropologies and what the general public uses without being aware of the academic debate. So I want to start with a brief outline of the academic debate, and then test the claims using a survey, and then the extent to which the public agrees with these, and then show evidence from in-depth interviews, which is a methodological divide in the social sciences I'll talk about what people would say on their own if you don't prompt them by giving them language about the human. So I'll start there where it's red. I'm essentially testing the claims of various humanistic thinkers about the influence of believing in the wrong anthropology. So most notably, there's a competition between scholars to get people to accept the theological, philosophical, or biological definitions of the human. Of course, there's many more. I'm just making generalizations here. So let me start with the theological. In the US, this means the Christian tradition, because Christians of various sorts have always dominated the public spheres, and there is no religious minority that clocks in at more than 2% of the population of the US. So I'm going to focus on the Christian tradition. And I don't need to read this. People are familiar with this concept from the Hebrew Scriptures, also used by the Christian tradition. But basically, this is the Christian theological anthropology, which is that humans are imago Dei. They are those who are made in the image of God. And not only are humans made in the image of God, they're special because they're the only beings to be made that way. Only humans speak to God directly, and only humans are given stewardship over all the other living things. Humans are special compared to animals. God made every human one at a time, and therefore each human is loved by God, and critically, humans have souls who allow for communication both vertically, as a theologian would say, to God, and then horizontally out to other people. That was some sort of divine retribution for my... If there's any theologians in the room, I'll just say I'm obviously making a massive generalizations across debates about theological anthropology, but again, that's what sociologists have to do. So, that's one idea of what a human being is. And what does it supposedly do? It's claimed by proponents that someone who believes in this anthropology will look at another human and see something different than if they looked and they were using a different anthropology. They would see someone with a severable, true, unchanging soul residing in the body, and that soul not only means that you are made in the image of God, but they are at least capable of communication with God. So Stephen Post writes, the purported moral significance of having an immaterial, immortal soul is that it ensures the moral commitment of a good society to protect all human beings based on their varied and unreliable capacities, and that's a dig at one of the competitors I'll get to in a minute, but on the basis of basic human equality. The largest people who talk this way are the Christian human rights theorists. And this is just a summary of some of this literature here. But basically, they claim that human rights cannot be justified without a sacred human of some sort. And the best or only way to create a sacred human is through this imago Dei idea. So Grace Cow summarizes this as basically the biblical idea of God's redemptive love for every creature that bears the imago Dei is that which correctly bestows each human being with great and equal worth. So this is one of the competitors in this debate. Do you think of humans as imago Dei, as individually sacred in this manner? And there's also a secular version of this, post-Kant, in Europe in particular, called human rights. Okay, there's a secular, but basically individuals become sacred in this way, but not in a theological sense. So now off to the philosophical. And again, like I said, I teach sociology of religion to undergraduates, and I first explain world religious history, and I go from this guy named Jesus to the United States in 9 minutes. And I say, well, I'm glossing a few details along the way. So I'm glossing a few details here. Technically, for any philosophers in the room, I acknowledge that philosophers are concerned with the person and not the human. Okay, but I'm just going to bracket that for now. And their debates are things like, is the obviously genetically human embryo a person, and thus deserving of the same treatment as the walking around consensual humans, and so on. Now, what the philosopher's version of what makes a human is based upon capacities. So there's no reason to memorize this list, but this is a typical list that people debate. Humans are those essentially that have consciousness, preferences, conscious desires, thoughts, rational thought. We could go on with this, but this isn't the point. The point isn't what's on the list. The point is that there is a list. Okay? Humans are those with the correct capacities. And there's you could spend your entire career arguing about what should or should not be on this list. But the argument about whether or not, for example, chimpanzees should be able to use the National Health Service is based upon the idea that they have enough of these things that make them persons. So, now, what does this mean for treatment? Critics of the philosophical anthropology claim that will influence the treatment of not only embryos and chimpanzees and the like, but us walking around sorts of humans. They claim that if you think of a human in that way, you will look at someone else and you'll see something different. You will see that those who have more of these capacities than others would have more value. And this is the underlying reasoning of the eugenics movement. Those who had better qualities, you were supposed to produce more of them. Those with fewer good qualities, you would want less of them. So people were not considered to be equal. Moreover, critics are concerned that we will treat humans more like we treat animals because we would subconsciously equate the two. Because in this distinction, there is no divide between human animals and other types of animals. It's just how many capacities you have. Hence, chimpanzees having the same treatment as humans, or dolphins, and things like this. And moreover, in this philosophical tradition, there are certain genetic humans who would have lesser rights than some animals. So most famously, Peter Singer has argued that newborn humans have less of these capacities than do chimpanzees, and therefore, if you needed to kill a newborn human, that would be less objectionable than killing a chimpanzee. So that's the argument you would create this confusion between humans and animals. Off to the biological. This is the sort of boogeyman of social science and humanists over the past 40 years, is the rise of some notion of the biologically defined human. The basic argument here is that whereas we once thought of ourselves as made in the image of God or human because of our human capacities, we now think of our humanness as reducible to a unique pattern of DNA. The central feature of this biological anthropology is that Darwinism explains everything important about being human. So in this view, we either are our genes, or in the milder version, anything that's important to know about us is in our genes, our DNA. So Pellegrino, in the middle there, writes that in this biological anthropology, mind, soul, emotion, spirit, all are simply epiphenomena of matter, explicable in terms of physics and chemistry. James Watson, who, if I remember correctly, discovered the structure of DNA down the street here, saw this as part and parcel of this sort of redefinition of life. I'll skip to the end of here where he says, we're talking about life. There's nothing special about it. It's simply a matter of chemistry. Okay? So this is sort of this anti-vitalist motion. There's nothing special, no spark, et cetera, et cetera. Humans are essentially defined by this DNA, which is ultimately a series of chemicals. So what's the fear here? This fear runs the gamut from sort of neo-Marxist left to neoconservative right, evangelical Protestants in the United States to atheists, feminists to everyone else. They all have some version of the same concern. This is Howard Kay, who's a sociologist, who says, as the putative genes for such things as schizophrenia, alcoholism, so on, are discovered and publicized, the cumulative effect will be the transformation of how we understand ourselves, from moral beings whose character and conduct is shaped by culture, to essentially biological beings whose fate, according to Project Head James Watson, is in our genes. So the concern is that this idea makes us humans appear to be more machine-like or object-like. Genes are portrayed in this determinative way. I was talking to high school students before they came, and their version of this was, well, some entities don't have free will, and therefore they're not human. They don't act on them. They've essentially been programmed. So that, well, DNA is portrayed as having this sort of program quality to it. Whether or not that's true or not doesn't matter. Okay, what matters is what people think. Okay, so the most extreme version of this would be something like Dawkins's argument that humans are essentially DNA replicating machines. So you get this sort of mechanistic quality. And what's the concern with treatment is that learning the biological version of this will teach us humans that we are like animals or objects, and then people can treat each other like animals or objects. If we are DNA, that's the same DNA that animals and plants have. If we're more machine-like, we can be treated like we treat machines. And so ultimately also, if you think of humans as essentially these chemical DNA with these chemical bodies, and we're essentially, as was said a minute ago, that life is simply a matter of chemistry, we will think of humans as chemicals, which is an object, and we can treat like we would have an object. So what I realized I have a close encounter as a sociologist with theology, philosophy, and the like, and thank goodness I have tenure, so they can't stop me anymore. But so the question I did upon reading all this is this true? This is actually an untested empirical claim that's been made for decades. And so I decided to test it, perhaps unwisely, because it's not easy to do, and we'll see if I succeed. And so what I did here, becomes the sociology part, where I did in-depth interviews with 50 ordinary Americans, roughly representing the population of the US, interviews with PhD students at a major research university on the west coast of the United States that remain unnamed, and a 3,500 nationally representative survey. I'm only going to talk about those two in green today. So I can assess whether the anthropologies lead to maltreatment with the National Representative Survey. And the surveys are perfect for this for two reasons. If this effect exists, it's so small that you guys wouldn't recognize it. If it was big, you'd already know this. You say, ah, we already know this, okay? If it's a small effect, but small effects only matter if there's a small effect where some new drug causes a 1 in 1 million increase in whatever, no one cares. But small effects matter if they theoretically accumulate into larger things. So if there's an effect here, in 10 generations, this would be a big effect. So one of the way I did this, I gave people this big, long thing about a statement from a professor, quote unquote, and asked them what they thought of it. This is the biological version. This is the sort of extremist biological version. This is not some high school biology teacher somewhere. This is essentially Richard Dawkins, okay, which is what all the critics are worried about. This is, we're this type of animal based upon our DNA. We're not more evolved or superior than other animals because each animal's traits fit their particular environment. You know, it goes on here, all the critics, all the reductionistic critics' portrayal of what people are talking about with this biological definition of the human. And you get to this whole very end here, and then the respondents are asked, you may agree or disagree with parts of the professor's statements. Do you agree or disagree overall? So every respondent gets plunked on sort of a scale of the extent to which they agree with this. I did similar things for the philosophical and the theological. So every person has this, like, where they are on this continuum. Well, so that's just assessing the extent the persons believe in different anthropologies. How about these? Those are supposed to impact what we think a human is. Like, I'm looking at someone, and it's supposedly going to change what I think of that person. So I asked what I'm calling general depictions. Are people special compared to animals? Is the human mind like a machine? In pre-testing, I asked if a human was like a machine, and people don't get that. And so I had to change this to human mind, so take that as a caveat. Are we unique? Or do we have equal value? Okay? So these are these basic challenges that all these people, critics, say, that if I think of a human in a particular way, I will think people have less value, like machines, not unique, and so on. And then finally, I asked about treatment. It's very hard to ask people about treatment because people do not admit to things. So you got to give people these sort of debates. Okay? So this is Truth in Advertising, essentially a debate between someone who believes in what I will call human rights and essentially utilitarians, for those of you familiar with this debate. So do you think it's okay to put US troops at risk to stop mass murder of an ethnic group in Eastern Europe? Can we buy kidneys from poor people? Should people with this, I realize from talking to high school students, makes a lot more sense in the US than it does in the UK, given you have the National Health Service. But in the US, people do ask their elderly parents to kill themselves to save money for their family, okay? And should we take blood against death row prisoners, which you might not have in Britain either, but welcome to America. Can you take blood against the will of these people and torturing terrorism suspects? So again, this is all a trade-off between essentially some sacred notion of the individual, in secular terms, rights discourse, versus utilitarian. A good utilitarian would say, yeah, if you're going to save 1,000 people by torturing the terrorism suspects, go ahead, because you're just torturing one person, you're going to save 1,000 lives. Okay, so what did I do here? For a general audience, I simply say I use ordered logistic regression models, and I sort of wave my hands like this, and then say you get to this answer here. Think of these as negative means inverse relationship. Little stars mean you can be confident that the results aren't due to random error. So basically, people who believe in this biological notion of the human are less likely to think humans are special compared to animals, less likely to think humans are equal value to each other, less likely to think they're unique, and more likely to think they're machines. Same thing with the philosophical. The theological is the inverse of that, but weaker. For some reason, equal value, contrasting what theologians would claim, at least for regular Americans, believing in a theological anthropology does not make you think people have equal value, okay, and doesn't do anything with machine-like, but I never really thought it would do much. It doesn't really have any valence for the machine-like thing. How about treating people? The biological, if you believe in that, you're less likely to want to stop genocide, more likely to say buy kidneys from poor people, suicide to save money, take blood from prisoners against their will. Same thing for the philosophical, except they say torturing is okay, but not the take blood from prisoners. And again, sort of mixed results from the theological. No difference on genocide, no difference on taking kidneys from poor people, or buying kidneys from poor people, but negative effects on suicide and taking blood from prisoners, no effect on torture. So the theological doesn't really have much of a positive valence despite what the proponents would claim. So the debate here about having the wrong definition of the human leading to maltreatment seems to be correct. I mean, since Darwin after Descent of Man in the 1870s created this debate about whether or not defining a human this way will lead to maltreatment, and people were arguing about that then. Recently, Jürgen Habermas in Germany has been claiming that if we genetically engineer any child, we'll come to think of all children as more machine-like. Papal encyclical is concerned about this. This has been over, but no one's really tested this, and I think the answer seems to be that all the critics seem to roughly be correct. Okay? But if I were to stop there, that I would have to turn in my PhD in sociology, because no one can tell that much of a simple story in sociology. You have to say it's more complicated than that. This was a test of what happens when I, the researcher, present language to the person saying, here's the definition of the human, what do you think of it? What would people do if they talked about it in their own language? Okay? This is important because this is, to the survey, this is the extent of agreement and disagreement with this. I show these effects, okay, that exist, but very few Americans strongly agree with this biological version, and very few agree with the philosophical version, okay? So the answer for this is that the critics should be vigilant against these extreme versions that exist, but they haven't spread very far into the American public. Very few Americans believe these sort of more extreme views that have these effects. So what do these people think? So I interviewed people to try to use their own language. If you interview people and start by saying, so tell me what's a human, you just get blank stare. You might as well walk up and say, ask the fish, tell me about this water. It just doesn't do anything. So the way you got to do this is you got to infer it by responses to multiple questions. And I asked about all these liminal entities. Should you kill a chimpanzee to save a human? If a computer had thoughts and memories, would it be me? Changing embryos, all these questions about these liminal objects. And I don't really care about their answer to the question itself. I want to know the why after each one of these things. Why? Why is it okay to kill a chimpanzee? Well, most evangelicals in the United States start this very easy. They basically, why kill a chimpanzee? Because chimpanzees are not made in the image of God and humans are. Why do they know that so well? There are institutions devoted to teaching that idea in the United States. Okay? So that makes sense why this would be the case. So when you generalize across all these things, you actually find people who generally believe in sort of a theological anthropology, a biological anthropology, and a philosophical anthropology. However, they're different than the academic version. The theological is roughly what the theologians would argue. I mean, you know, as close as you can get with this sort of social science. So I'm not going to talk further about that at this point. But basically, the differences are pretty subtle. Let's first talk about the biological difference. And the thing you have to remember is there's different reasoning between the way academics make ethical arguments and regular people do. Academics start with deductive reason, where they basically say, I have a principle, and does this fit into this principle? If so, that's the case. So humans are those with a certain DNA sequence. Does this entity have that? Yes, no, in or out. Regular people engage in what's called casuistry. This is not exactly what the Catholic version of casuistry, but close enough. Basically, you look for an ideal type that you've already made a decision on, and if this case is like that case, you've made your decision. Okay? In at least American law is based upon this very idea. They just call it precedent. If this situation is like that previous court case, you've made your decision. Okay? So in the academic debate then, where are you going to find your ideal type case of a human to make your metaphor with to see whether or not something's human? So if I were to ask you, where do you look? Well, there's one entity you know is human if you're being interviewed, which is yourself. Okay? And so you don't start with some abstract prop and look at your hand and say, oh, I wonder if there's DNA in here. I wonder if my DNA sequence, you know, my hand. No, you think of, I know I'm human. Okay? And so let me illustrate this with an interview with this person I'll call Jerry. Okay? She basically makes two claims about the human that are based in a form of biology. A human is that which looks like a human. Now, I recognize in academia, a tautological argument like that is going to get you thrown out of school, because you need a definition of the human to come up with the definition of the human. But that is how not only casuistry works, but how regular people reason. So she thinks, what is it about me that makes me human? And she says, I look like a human, and I was born like a human. Okay, now recognize this has some implications for various reproductive technologies, but that's aside. So I ask her these questions, and basically you get no productive responses. This is typical, where you start asking people questions, they don't say anything of any use, you push them a little bit, you can't push them too hard or they give up on you, so I'm like, all right, we'll let that go. Is the enhanced baby human? And she, well, she didn't stop and say, I wonder if that baby's made in the image of God. She didn't stop and say, I wonder what its DNA is. She says, how was this embryo created? Did they take an embryo that was growing and change it? If so, I think it would still be human because of the way it was created. That's why I asked, because I was wondering if it was like a petri dish creation. So she has this version of humans are not those who are created outside of the body. Now, again, she would reject IVF and these sorts of things, presumably. But she has this idea, like, I was born in this particular way, so that's what a human is. I asked her, can an embryo be changed so much that it's no longer human? Well, no, unless you change the construction of humans, like if you were to change the way we looked, or maybe change the way we act, because I feel like humans have a similar way of processing and thinking, or just like the physical appearance. So again, no academic is going to argue this way. Looks like a human is determined by looking at yourself and saying, okay, 2 arms, 2 eyes, etc. She has a moment of sounding like a biology PhD student, where I asked about the monkey-human hybrid. She comes up with speciation, which is the scientific definition, which is a different species are the ones that can or cannot breed with each other. But this just reminds us that when you do studies of the public, no one is pure. The only people who have pure, logically coherent thoughts are people who are paid to do so, like academics. Regular people don't. They just don't have the time or the money, basically. And so when I asked, this is about Terry Schiavo, which is a famous case of this woman in the United States who was comatose, and they ended her life, and it was a very big legal case. So is she still human? Well, yes, they're human, because there's still people, I would say they're still human, but they're not living a typical life. And she says, why was Terry Schiavo still a human? She had a normal life ahead of time. She was human, and that part of the rest of her life had stopped. So she had a normal life, lived, had a family and whatnot, and so she couldn't continue on. She's still human. So once you're human, you're always human, okay? Which, again, wouldn't be a principle you would find in these other debates, but it's something that the regular people seem to say. Let me jump forward here. Again, she makes another claim about unnaturalness being removed from the body. Humans are those who are born in the way she was, basically. When I summarize and ask, what's a human? She says, well, can I just say the way a human looks? I don't know how to describe someone who walks on two legs, and this is the moment where people realize, oh, there's bad implications of what I'm about to say, okay? But then they say it anyway, because again, this is how people are going to act in the public sphere when you ask them to. So she basically has some notion of humans are those who are like me, which is very removed from the way the academics talk about it. Let me quickly go over the difference with the philosophical anthropology, which was amazing to me. I will sort of preface by saying these 16-year-old kids in this high school class this morning were totally like my American subjects in this regard, which is, I think, is very interesting. Let me make a distinction between what I'll call autonomous and social traits, okay? When you look at the philosophers, they're interested in what I would call autonomous traits, which are traits that would matter or capacities that would matter if you spent your whole life in a box, okay? Consciousness, rationality, they have nothing to do with interacting with other people at all, okay? They're just capacities an individual would have if they were just all by themselves. So Peter Singer says you could summarize his view as a human is that which has some level of self-awareness. Or Tooley says capacity for rational thought, self-consciousness, okay? These are unsocial sort of capacities. But the public does use those, the people who talk about capacities do talk about those, but then they add in a bunch of things, what I'll call social traits or social capacities, ability to love, show compassion, empathy, having feelings, emotions, communicate with others. And all the high school kids today, that was what they immediately gravitated to, actually. Humans are those who have those sorts of capacities, but those are by and large lacking in the academic debate. So quickly running through an interview with this guy named Sam. So should we kill a chimp to save a human? Yes, kill the chimp, okay? Like anything, it's a matter of excellence. They're not as excellent as we are, but we have our ability to show compassion, ability to critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, okay? Is the enhanced baby human? This is the, if you're familiar with American comic books, this is the Daredevil theory of human behavior, which is if you're missing one sense, somehow the rest of them develop stronger. If this baby was super strong, they wouldn't need the other senses, essentially, but they would lose their ability to love, ability to feel emotions, and maybe they're so bright they just completely rational and logical. By and large, when you ask ordinary people about this, the more rational and logical you are, the less human you're considered to be. Okay? And so like they'll break out examples like Mr. Spock on Star Trek is too rational and logical, he's not human. Okay? And they sort of you merge into being sort of machine-like at a certain point, even though those are the capacities most valued by philosophers. Is the embryo human? Lump of cells, not human. I can't tell you I love you. The embryo debate does not consist of debates about whether embryos can say I love you. They consider debates whether embryos have capacities like a central nervous system, et cetera, et cetera. So he rings in. I finally say, okay, what's your summary of this? Because after talking to these people for like 30 minutes, they finally develop their own language to talk about the human. They can't do it right off the bat. I said, well, all the capacities for being a human. And notice, he doesn't say anything about biology, anything about DNA, anything about made in the image of God. This is a capacities person, sort of an ideal type capacities person. But his list of capacities include ability to reason with each other, our environment, have relationships, have language, fall in love. Okay? It's interesting little linguistic quirk that really tipped me off to this in the first place, which is, at least Americans, when they start talking about these autonomous traits like rationality, they talk about human being. When they talk about the others, they talk about being human. Okay? And they don't recognize that they're switching back and forth. But you can see how that difference right there. Okay. So earlier I basically said if everyone sort of take this extreme view of a human that's defined by the academic debate, it seems like there'd be less support for human rights and the like. And that's sort of a, in my view, a bad thing. But how about this public version? Is this a bad thing? Well, let me just briefly summarize. What is it about? I don't have data on this, and the reason I don't have data is in an in-depth interview you can't say, so tell me about torturing people. I mean, people are not going to give you legitimate responses. And so let's just be speculative here, which is with this normal person's version of biological, there's a sort of a good side and a bad side to this. If you're about to do something really bad to someone, you're not thinking of them as like an object, you're not thinking of them as chemicals, you're not thinking of the DNA, you're thinking of them like yourself, okay? So that would seemingly cut back on the willingness to sort of maltreat someone because it's like, oh, they're like me. The flip side of that is I think the history of racism and everything else in the world would suggest that that's grounds for people saying, oh, they're not like me. They can be enslaved, et cetera, et cetera. So this is like the good and the bad of this perspective, okay, that people need to be, aware of. And so in a way, the academic debate sort of frees you from that, but supposedly creates these other problems, whereas the sort of people's regular impulse is to say, well, they're not like me. I think the public's version of the philosophical is actually slightly more interesting, which is that let's say you define people by the ability to show love. There have been no eugenic proposals made that we should select people on the basis of ability to show love. All these sort of eugenic schemes in science fiction and otherwise are based on like intelligence, strength, beauty, not about these sort of interactive capacities. So again, I don't think that people are going to be maltreated due to their lack of things like ability to show love. Moreover, social traits lead us to think of humans in social terms. Like imagine I'm evaluating some entity. Should I mistreat this entity? You're defining them not in these autonomous terms, but as relational, like relational to me. Like, oh, compassion, they can have compassion, which is a reaction to me. So you think of them as some sort of a dialogic with yourself. And then to be sort of reflexive on this, if you're imagining some entity on a pedestal and you're deciding whether or not how to treat them, and you've defined a human as that which shows love, okay, you look at them and say, that which shows love, but I'm a human, and I'm doing the evaluating, and so I'm one who should show love. And so these sort of relational capacities would presumably lead to not mistreating other people. But I don't have sort of definitive data on that. That is sort of my speculation. So that was a lot. Let me try to summarize. The biological and philosophical anthropologies, as defined by the academic debate as the sort of extreme form, are associated in the American public with thinking of humans as more object-like. Similarly, they're associated with thinking that it's acceptable to buy kidneys, commit suicide to save money, not stopping genocides and the like. But few members of the American public agree with those extreme versions when you present them to them, okay? Which would mean that critics should remain vigilant because apparently the negative effects of these extreme anthropologies exist, but very few Americans at present accept that. The anthropologies the public does currently use include the philosophical and biological versions, but these are different from the academic versions, and I would argue that they're unlikely to lead to less support for what I'm calling human rights. So with that, I'd like to stop and answer any questions you might have.
All right, thank you very much. We've got good time for questions. Who would like to kick off? Joe, I got the microphone. There's one down the front here.
A question perhaps for today, because there's something going on in the States.
Yeah.
Have you detected a difference between the responses that you get from what are loosely described as evangelical Christians and Christians who are of a more liberal disposition? Because things, from my perspective, seem to be much more polarized in the States than they are here.
Yeah.
And their views of humanity, you know, whether all people are equal, whether you think apartheid is a good thing, and whether you want to keep out the Mexicans, or, you know, the whole toss.
Yeah. So preface this by saying that what evangelicalism means in the United States is quite different from what it means in the UK. And, you know, to make sweeping generalizations, what is called an evangelical in the US is more conservative than what's called an evangelical in the UK. So my massive generalization for the day. Yeah, so number one is that the only people who know the Imago Dei concept at all are the evangelicals, and the Catholics and mainliners don't know it. Yep. Okay? Which is consistent with what is known about theological education among children, which is in the US, they did extensive studies of children, and the only people who know their own tradition are Mormons, and then evangelicals barely know their own tradition, and Catholics and mainliners don't know it at all, and Jews don't know it at all. Okay? And so, and then also in general, as we know from the current election, and I appreciate the fact that you're all offering me asylum here at the end of the day. But as we know from the election, I would argue that what's going on among evangelicals, this created sort of a crisis among evangelical intellectuals in the United States, which is basically, how could the people all support Trump? So if you look at this sort of a big regression model, and you sort of parse out the variance, I would argue that what's happening is the evangelicals in the United States who support Trump are letting their whiteness, their maleness, their ruralness, their classness determine their views on things and not their religion, okay? And I think you could find something similar in this sort of thing, which is that I think it's essentially overwhelmed by the other features of their life. And I think that I've got another book that's under review that shows essentially one of the problems with evangelicalism, even in my short life in the United States, is it's become almost purely therapeutic. You know, essentially it's about sort of how you feel better, you know, sort of thing, instead of about doctrinal sort of issues. I think that's really comes through the fore if you look at the detailed data of this. So we can talk more about that later if you want.
Well, thank you, Professor. That was really brilliant. If I were having a discussion with the biological extremist person, how would the debate go about the issue of consciousness? There isn't a gene for consciousness. So where does that fit in the biological extremist's argument?
Yeah,
or is there a gene for consciousness?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think well, they would say there is a interaction, like 1,000 genes that interact in some complicated way that produce consciousness, right? In some impossible to describe way. And that chimpanzees have some modicum of consciousness, but fish don't. I mean, obviously, who knows, right? But and so it's a bit hard to answer your question, but let me, I think this might get me halfway down the road. So one of the details I'm glossing over here is that these anthropologies are actually like Russian nested dolls. Okay? And so the people who believe in this philosophical capacities also believe in the biological in the sense that they say, well, those are all caused by your genes. And the reason humans have these things is they have a genetic difference from cows and pigs. The religious people, the Christians at least that I talked to, put another thing on top of that and say the reason that all of that stuff exists is that we're all Imago Dei. Okay? So it does have this nested quality to it. And so it's more like the effect of not having an upper doll is what I'm more talking about.
Hello, yes. It occurred to me while you were discussing the three positions, the theological, the philosophical, and the biological, that neither the philosophical nor the biological have a coherent definition of a human being. So usually when we say that there's a definition of something, we mean to specify out one thing that it is. But when you were describing the philosophical position, you described how there's a potentially infinite list of capacities. And the biological position is even worse because there's potentially infinite number of parts.
Right.
So neither of them really have a conception of human being. So I wonder whether the perplexity that your subjects find when they have to answer this question is that they have to develop not simply a philosophical account or a biological account, but they have to develop an alternative theological account that can designate one specific person or even one specific species that constitutes a human being that is constituted from all of these different capabilities or biological parts.
Yeah, I mean, so my first instinct is to say that regular folks wouldn't even approach anything like that level of complexity. I mean, I agree with you that that would need to be the case. Now, of course, when you say there's no definition, I mean, Peter Singer will tell you there is a true definition of the human, and I have it, you know, but there isn't agreement among these people is the problem. Although now to sort of put an asterisk is there are also not agreements about what it means to be made in the image of God. I'm sure there's like many linear feet of that debate about that. But I think the perplexity of people is not so much that they have to come to some sort of conclusion, but that the idea that there are capacities at all, and that people are familiar with that idea in general, even if they don't have some sort of specific list. So in the US, everyone learns that because they know about abortion, legal abortion cases, which are based upon philosophical anthropology. So abortion is available at a certain point because of evolving capacities. And everyone, not everyone, a lot of people have these living wills where you can have your life support ended when you lose certain capacities. So people are familiar with that concept. So I think the way you're describing definitely adds to all of the fuzz in all of this and the difficulty of doing a project like this. I think there are these sort of broad generalizations that people get. And the reason I can tell is that there are people who do not say anything about biology at all. And there are people who only talk about capacities, just nowhere near the level of precision that these people do.
A key attribute, possibly across all three definitions, apart from the image of God, is consciousness, which may be hard to measure. What would we do if we met another being who was definitely conscious?
Yeah. Well, so that would be the big debate. I mean, so for example, I mean, there's actually very interesting, I think science fiction is the best investigator of these sorts of ideas that exists. Doesn't usually come to answers, but it's a really good investigator. This is the exact debate, which is that there have been legal attempts in the European Union to make chimpanzees persons based upon that. And the people who do this have all sorts of tests. I mean, so again, like how you construct your test of what consciousness is going to determine your outcome. But people have done tests of various animals and have concluded they have consciousness. I don't know what does it require? I mean, so I know some of them are like you give a chimpanzee a mirror, you know, and they act like we would towards the mirror, this kind of thing. So yeah, that's the question. Now, what would happen? There's been an interesting sort of abstract debate. What happens when the aliens show up, you know? But I actually think the debate that it's really going to hit, perhaps not in our lifetimes, but maybe in my children's lifetime, is not that. It's going to be the machines. I mean, I really think at a certain point, I mean, machines already have many of these attributes, and we don't treat them as such because we know they're machines. But at a certain point, this might be, I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm totally living in Star Trek land, but that I think is more imminent.
Further on the back row.
How can you be sure that a respondent's behavior or attitude in those different scenarios is caused by their ideology and isn't the other way around, that their ideology comes about from who they are as a person for some other reason, if you understand? So you're establishing a correlation, but how do you know the direction of causality?
Right. So the answer in social science, well, first of all, the gold standard of this sort of thing in academia writ large would be the experiment, okay? But of course, philosophers of science will tell us that that's massively overblown, that a double-blind experiment doesn't show that either. But I'm willing to concede that an experiment gets you further down the path of causality, okay? And I can't do experiments, although I'd like to create a society where, you know, and raise these people differently, et cetera. So the social science version of this is to try to, quote unquote, control for alternative explanations, okay? So for example, skipping the moment where I went like this meant that with the survey data, I controlled for every possible covariate that could be an explanation, education, you know, ideology. This is all net of every other reason you could measure in a survey for why someone would be that way, which isn't the total explanation, but that's as good as you can get. After that, people just argue on sort of logical grounds that it can't be X, Y, and Z. With the qualitative data, I can't do that, okay? Because I have a limited number of people. So instead, what you do is you rule out alternative interpretations, not mathematically, but essentially through the words that people themselves use. And so if someone was truly motivated by some other thing, I should be able to discern that in the way that they talk. Deeply unsatisfying answer, I know, but essentially that is the sort of state of the science of social science at this point.
Okay, thanks.
Can I ask, are these things fixed in people's minds, or do they change with age, experience, rational argument?
I don't know, but I would say that these are certainly changeable because, again, this is sort of more based upon sociological theory, which is the things that really become cemented in your brain literally do all the time, okay? And so how people should treat their children gets kind of like cemented in your brain as you're treating your children for 18 years. This kind of thing is more episodic and doesn't really come up very often, and so is typically would be less stable. This is sort of a grand sociology theory statement. Yet I would say that doesn't make these things less important. It makes them more important. Now the other thing I would say is that this other thing is all based upon, there's a huge part of this project which is in the book, and for every book you buy, it's $1 for my daughter's college education fund. That the other thing I would say about this is that I'm looking for institutions that teach these ideas, and that's why I interview these PhD students, because if a PhD student in biology doesn't believe in the biological anthropology, then nobody does. Okay, these are people who, I mean, they are PhD students in biological laboratories at one of the best biology PhD universities in the United States, okay? And I was confirmed that, yes, they are definitely more believers in the biological anthropology than my matching sample of humanists, okay? Which implies that there's something about biological education that teaches this to someone. Yes, there could be a pre-selection effect where people who already have these sorts of views become biology majors, which is impossible to detangle with the data, but it's consistent with the data that they learn this. The other thing that's quite obvious is that evangelicals learn this. Although I think it's interesting for people to reflect on is that they've learned this from the abortion debate, which is a different version of the sort of walking around thing. And so when people talk about what it means, they use these narratives like Psalm 139, you know, babies knitted together in the womb. A lot of evangelicals talk this knitted together language that they would only use in the abortion debate. And that's actually a sort of different thing that this debate's about. So the emphasis on that in the United States has sort of transformed the discourse of evangelicalism, which I think is an interesting side light that I couldn't get into with the book.
Dennis, and that's probably the last question, I think.
Just a follow-up question on those comments you just made. Do you think do you have any sociological data suggesting that evangelicals would choose not to go and become PhDs in biology because there's a sense that they might be fearful their faith might be upset by the biology in some way? Or do you have data on that? Is there data on that?
No, but I really want that data for my next project is essentially about this, which is essentially, religion and science among regular people, which I published a number of journal articles on. And how would I put this? It is important for my stated claims to date about American society that the following be true. And if not, I'm willing to say I'm wrong, okay? That evangelical Protestants are equally willing to be chemistry majors, physics majors, every science major as anyone else except biology, okay? And because biology, at least as it's constructed in the United States, and I think especially as it's constructed in evangelical discourse in the United States, is the one that has the sort of definite negative effect on your moral beliefs, whereas physics and these things aren't. So it's not an epistemic problem. So in the other things that I write about, my point is that there is no conflict between religion and science among ordinary people on epistemic terms about how you generate knowledge in the United States. If you ask ordinary people, ask evangelicals, or skipping evangelicals, you find fundamentalists, which is in the U.S. yet another different group, essentially. You ask fundamentalists how you determine the speeds of butterfly wings, you will get the scientific method to the T, okay? You ask how photosynthesis works, you will get the scientific method to the T. So every regular Christian in the United States is equally supportive of scientific knowledge generation, with the exception of like 2 or 3 fact claims having to do with human origins. But you look at the same data and you see there are these huge differences in what I would call moral conflict with science, which is this great concern that science leads to materialistic philosophy, which leads to this, which leads to this, and more importantly, things like scientists are the ones who advocate for embryonic stem cell research, and we don't agree with that. So scientists in general have this moral sort of problem. So in terms of like knowledge generation, that's not an issue for regular people, but there's this moral conflict. So the answer is, I want to gather such data and see if it's correct, but I am not aware of its existence, and I have looked high and low for anyone who has such data, and I don't believe it exists.
Fascinating. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you for a superb seminar today. Thank you for making us think and entertaining us at the same time. Thank you very much. Will you join me?